Today, we are strapping in for, well, what is perhaps the definitive story of the turning point of World War II.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Battle of Stalingrad.
It's just a colossal, brutal conflict. It raged for 199 days, starting back in July 1942 and ending in February of 43. And this battle, it consumed millions of lives. It was the place where German military ambition literally froze and starved to death on the Volga.
And our mission for this deep dive is to get past some of the simpler narratives. You know, the ones about just sheer Soviet courage or boundless German brutality. We want to get into the military and strategic details that really explain this profound shift.
Exactly.
How did the Soviets, who were reeling from these repeated, almost fatal military disasters in 1942, manage to execute the complete encirclement and then the annihilation of the mighty German Sixth Army?
And we're going to focus specifically on the incredible strategic genius of the Soviet command. I mean, the sophisticated, coordinated planning and deception, the famous Maskirovka. We'll be looking at the interplay between Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky, and how that genius was juxtaposed against, well, colossal German hubris and equally catastrophic logistical failures.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're looking at the ultimate trap. It's a textbook example of what they call deep operations, codenamed Operation Uranus. And crucially, how the Germans just failed utterly to predict it, even though the signs and, the intelligence warnings were practically screaming at them from the front lines.
To really appreciate the brilliance of the trap that the Soviets set at Stalingrad, you have to understand the depth of the existential hole they were in during that first half of 1942.
It was just a terrible time for them.
It was a period defined by one disaster after another. I mean, truly.
And a lot of those disasters, they seem to stem from the top, right?
Yeah.
Specifically from Stalin's own strategic miscalculation about the German summer offensive, which was codenamed Case Blue. So even after the Wehrmacht failed to take Moscow in 41, Stalin was just. He was convinced that the Germans would go for the capital again, that it was their main objective.
He was completely fixated on it. He prioritized defending Moscow, and he allocated, very limited reinforcements to other sectors. And what made it worse was, despite advice from his most capable commanders, we're talking men like Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov, Vasilevsky, and Zhukov.
The big names.
The very top. They were all urging him to focus on active strategic defense, to save their meager resources. But Stalin, he wanted local attacks. He approved them across the front early in the year, and they turned out to be devastatingly premature.
And the centerpiece of this massive failure has to be the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942. I mean, this wasn't just a minor setback. This was a strategic catastrophe.
Oh, absolutely.
It left the entire southern USSR just wide open.
It was ruinous. The commander of the southwestern main direction, Semyon Timoshenko, he proposed this attack to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army. It was a massive thrust from the Izium salient.
And initially it seemed to work, right? They had some success.
They did, for a moment. They created a bit of panic, actually. It caused General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, to immediately request reinforcements. But the Germans were still masters of that swift, coordinated counterattack.
Till they get back.
They launched Operation Frederikus I on May 17th, and the Soviets were caught completely off balance. The Red Army was just devastated.
How bad was it?
The operation shattered 5 entire Soviet armies. It cost the Red Army almost 300,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured. It was just a brutal showcase of every weakness the Soviets still had at that time.
Like what specifically?
Well, poor operational intelligence, for one. Severe logistical shortcomings, which meant their leading tank columns were literally running out of fuel mid-attack.
Wow.
And, they really struggled to maneuver their new large armored divisions in these coordinated thrusts. It was a skill they just hadn't mastered yet.
So that defeat just annihilated their strategic reserves in the south.
Completely. It left the whole front exposed, perfectly setting the stage for the massive German summer offensive, which kicked off in late June 1942. I mean, for a moment there, it really looked like the USSR was on the verge of total collapse all over again.
And this is where Hitler comes in with what a lot of historians call the critical strategic mistake of the entire war. Despite the early success of Case Blue, which saw German forces pushing deep into the south toward the Caucasus, Hitler diverts the Sixth Army's main objective. He points it straight at the city of Stalingrad itself.
And that wasn't the original plan. The original, sensible military goal was about securing the northern flank of the German advance and, way more importantly, getting to the Caucasus oil fields further south. That was the real strategic prize.
But Hitler got obsessed.
Almost psychotically obsessed. Just because the city bore his enemy's name, it became a personal vendetta.
And that obsession was a profound military blunder.
Absolutely. By committing such vast resources, we're talking initially 270,000 Axis personnel, hundreds of tanks, eventually 1,600 aircraft in Luftwaffe all, to capture a city that was, militarily speaking, only really important because it controlled the Volga River supply route.
He overcommitted. He dragged the Sixth Army into this brutal, time-consuming urban meat grinder.
And he completely, utterly underestimated the Red Army's resilience and, crucially, their massive, hidden manpower reserves in the strategic rear. For the first time, the Germans had left themselves dangerously exposed on both flanks.
So the key takeaway here isn't just that the Soviets were losing badly. It's that those losses, combined with Hitler's emotional decision-making, actually forced the Germans into a strategically precarious position, one they just couldn't defend later on.
Exactly. The seeds of the disaster were sown right there. As the Sixth Army pressed its attack towards the Volga, they were met with just unprecedented levels of brutality, starting with the city's destruction.
The initial aerial assault, it wasn't just to soften defenses, was it? It was designed to completely annihilate the will to resist.
It was terror bombing. The scale of that opening strike on August 23, 1942, is just terrifying to think about. General Logerst Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftwaffe 4 dropped around 1,000 tons of bombs in a single day.
1,000 tons?
It was the single most intense aerial bombardment scene on the Eastern Front up to that point. It just turned Stalingrad into a sea of rubble and fire.
The damage was total.
At least 90% of the city's housing stock was obliterated. Civilian casualties were just staggering. Later estimates for that first week of bombing alone run as high as 70,000 civilians dead.
And this instant transformation of the city into this shattered landscape, it was critical, wasn't it? It immediately negated the German advantage in mobile warfare.
It did. And here's where the grim determination and sometimes the callous calculation of the Soviet command comes into play. It's widely noted that Stalin may have deliberately prevented civilians from leaving the city.
Why would he do that?
The thinking was brutal. Their presence would encourage a more desperate, more fanatical resistance from the city's defenders who knew they had their families, their neighbors, right behind them.
And many of those civilians, women and children included, they were put to work building fortifications under fire.
They were. And the resistance they put up was often shocking to the Germans. One of the first units encountered by the German 16th Panzer and 3rd Motorized Divisions was the Hen 77th Anti-Aircraft Regiment.
And they were defending the huge Stalingrad tractor factory complex, right?
Exactly. And this regiment was unusual because many of its crews, the directing and range-finding crews, even some of the gun crews, they were staffed by women.
That must have been a huge surprise for the Germans. They're expecting to roll over exhausted men, not run into anti-aircraft batteries crewed by young women.
Precisely. The 6th Battery alone claimed to have destroyed 28 German tanks in the fighting that day. I mean, they demonstrated this exceptional steadfastness, this heroism, even as the regiment lost 35 of its guns. It absolutely stunned the Germans. It forced them to pause and reconsider the depth of the resistance they were facing.
So as the fighting devolves into this infamous Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, inside the ruins, the Soviet defensive tactics, championed by Commander Vasily Chukov of the 62nd Army, they start to turn the tables on the Germans' combined arms doctrine.
Chukov was brilliant. He realized that in the chaos of the rubble, the Red Army had to neutralize the two things that gave the Wehrmacht its edge: the coordination between infantry and artillery and the total dominance of the Stuka dive bombers.
And his big innovation was the tactic of hugging the enemy. It sounds simple, but how did fighting at point-blank range fundamentally break that vaunted German military machine?
Well, it was as much psychological warfare as it was physical. Hugging the enemy meant keeping your frontline position so incredibly close to theirs. We're talking separated only by a wall, a staircase, a few yards of rubble, that their most effective weapons, their heavy artillery, and those fearsome Stukas couldn't be used.
Because they'd risk hitting their own men.
Massive friendly fire, exactly. So the German infantryman, who was trained to rely completely on immediate air cover or artillery support, suddenly finds himself in a knife fight with no backup.
That's a terrifying prospect.
It forced the German military into the one type of fighting they were least suited for: close quarters, small unit, decentralized combat. Often at night, which was disorienting and terrifying. It meant the tactical commander on the ground had to rely solely on his rifle and grenade, not the heavy firepower that had defined their blitzkrieg success.
And the sources detail this shift, don't they? We're talking about hand-to-hand fighting, where soldiers are using entrenching spades as axes or knives.
Yes.
They're operating in these tiny assault groups, using the sewers, breaching walls into adjoining buildings to stay concealed and strike the German rear. And those night attacks were particularly effective.
Incredibly so. They deprived the Germans of desperately needed sleep and just rapidly wore down their morale. The German advance became measured not in kilometers, but in inches. The city fight became focused on holding these individual strong points, turning every single factory, every grain silo, every half-burnt building into a fortress.
Like Pavlov's house, that's the famous example.
Yeah.
A seemingly ordinary 4-story building overlooking a square, held for 2 months by a tiny platoon under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. Maybe 30 men in total.
And it became a point of obsession for the Germans. They poured immense resources into trying to dislodge this one small group. They even labeled the building Festung Fortress on their tactical maps.
And didn't Zhukov himself later claim that the small group defending that one house killed more enemy soldiers than the Germans lost taking Paris in 1940?
He did. Now, whether or not that's perfectly accurate, it speaks to the scale of attrition that German forces were suffering against these incredibly localized, fanatical defenses. It was death by 1,000 cuts.
The horror of this fighting, I think it's best captured in that journal entry from a German lieutenant with the 24th Panzer Division.
Oh, yes.
The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. I mean, that just perfectly captures the complete breakdown of the environment.
And that endurance wasn't just fueled by courage. It was also fueled by sheer institutional terror. And that brings us to order number 227.
Stalin's infamous not a step back decree from July 1942.
That's the one. This order installed what they called blocking detachments. They were composed of either NKVD, the secret police, or regular reserve troops.
And their job was just to stand behind the front lines and shoot their own men.
Essentially, yes. To execute deserters and malingerers who tried to flee the fight. It was a shocking, brutal measure. For the Stalingrad and Don fronts alone, these detachments detained over 50,000 men by mid-October. They executed almost 1,000. We know the 62nd Army alone had 49 executions.
But what's so fascinating, and just horribly counterintuitive, is that some veterans later reported feeling a strange sense of relief. Why relief?
Because the expectation was now crystal clear. Retreat meant certain death at the hands of their own side, so fighting forward was the only possible way to survive. The order removed the personal choice to flee. It channeled all energy, all desperation toward the enemy.
So Stalingrad becomes this infernal cauldron, just consuming German manpower and resources, exactly as the Soviets intended.
The German objective shifts from taking a strategic position to, well, sheer vengeance and attrition. But while the